The floorboards of the Mitchell family home groaned under Sarah's weight as she descended into the basement, dust motes dancing in the pale shaft of afternoon light that followed her down. At 35, Dr. Sarah Mitchell had spent most of her adult life buried in historical documents, but she had never expected to find history buried beneath her own feet. The house, inherited from her grandmother just 3 months ago, had revealed its secrets reluctantly, like an old woman finally ready to confess her sins. The sledgehammer felt heavy in her hands as she struck the final blow against the false wall she had discovered behind decades of accumulated storage. The hollow sound had haunted her dreams for weeks, whispering promises of hidden truths. As the last brick crumbled away, a rush of stale air escaped, carrying with it the musty scent of centuries-old secrets. There, nestled in a cavity that seemed to have been waiting for her discovery, sat an ornate wooden chest. The craftsmanship was unmistakably colonial, its iron hinges green with age but still intact. Sarah's heart pounded as she carefully lifted it from its resting place. The weight surprised her, not just physically, but emotionally. This felt like holding the past itself, dense with untold stories. Her hands trembled as she carried the chest upstairs to her study, where afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating shelves lined with historical texts and research materials. Salem's autumn air drifted through slightly open windows, carrying the distant sounds of tourists exploring the town's infamous witch trial sites. How fitting, Sarah thought, that she should make this discovery in October, when Salem came alive with ghost tours and Halloween festivities. The chest opened with a soft click, as if it had been waiting 3 centuries for this moment. Inside, wrapped in what appeared to be oiled cloth, lay a collection of documents that made Sarah's breath catch. The paper was yellowed and brittle, but remarkably preserved. The first document bore a date that made her pulse quicken, September 15th, 1692. At the top, in careful colonial script, were the words, "The true testimony of Thomas Mitchell, magistrate of Salem." Sarah sank into her leather chair, her scholarly mind racing. Thomas Mitchell had been her ancestor, a detail that had always been whispered about in family gatherings but never fully explored. She had known he was involved in the witch trials, but the family had always maintained he was a minor figure, perhaps a clerk or witness. This document suggested otherwise. As she carefully unfolded the first page, Thomas's words seemed to rise from the paper like ghosts seeking voice. "I write this confession in the final days of my mortal existence, burdened by knowledge that will damn not only my soul, but the souls of generations yet unborn. What we did in Salem was not justice. What we allowed to escape was not human." The words sent a chill through Sarah's bones. She had studied the Salem witch trials extensively in her work as a colonial historian, but this testimony contained details she had never encountered. Thomas wrote of secret meetings held after the official trials ended, of decisions made in shadow that would affect Salem for centuries to come. Most disturbing of all, he wrote of Elizabeth Hawthorne, a woman who had been sentenced to hang, but who had somehow vanished from her cell the night before her execution. Elizabeth Hawthorne possessed knowledge that terrified even those of us who condemned her, Thomas had written. In exchange for her freedom, she offered us something no mortal should possess, the promise of prosperity for our bloodlines, purchased with the silence of the grave. We were fools to believe we could make such a bargain without consequence. Sarah's hands shook as she set down the document. Outside her window, Salem's church bells chimed 5 o'clock, their bronze voices carrying across the town that had built its identity on the very trials her ancestor had helped orchestrate. But according to this testimony, the trials had not ended with the last execution. They had simply gone underground, transformed into something far more sinister than history had recorded. As darkness began to creep across her study, Sarah noticed something else in the chest, a small bundle of what appeared to be more recent documents. The paper was different, aged, but not centuries old. Her heart stopped as she recognized the handwriting from the first document. It was identical, down to the distinctive loops and crosses. But the date on this newer page read December 1st, 1891, and was signed with the same name, Elizabeth Hawthorne. The impossible realization struck Sarah like a physical blow. If these documents were authentic, Elizabeth Hawthorne had not only escaped her execution in 1692, but had continued to exist, to write, to live, for at least 200 years after her supposed death. And if the pattern held, if Sarah's growing suspicion proved correct, Elizabeth Hawthorne might still be alive today, walking the streets of Salem, while tourists snapped photos of the memorial built to honor her alleged victims. Sarah reached for her phone, then hesitated. Who could she call? Who would believe such an incredible claim? Instead, she turned back to the documents, driven by an insatiable need to understand the full scope of what her ancestor had unleashed upon the world. As night settled over Salem like a familiar black shawl, Sarah began to read deeper into the testimony that would forever change her understanding of her family's role in one of America's darkest chapters. Outside, a figure stood motionless beneath the old oak tree across from Sarah's house, watching the light in her study window with eyes that had witnessed the witch trials firsthand. Elizabeth Hawthorne smiled, her face unlined despite the centuries that had passed, and whispered words in a language older than English, older than the New World itself. Sarah spent the night hunched over the documents, her coffee growing cold as she pieced together a story that defied rational explanation. The testimonies painted a picture of Salem far darker than any history book had ever dared suggest. Elizabeth Hawthorne had not been an innocent victim of mass hysteria, but something far more sinister. According to Thomas Mitchell's account, she had demonstrated abilities that convinced even the most skeptical magistrates that witchcraft was real. By dawn, Sarah's eyes burned with exhaustion, but she had translated enough of the archaic language to understand the horrifying scope of her discovery. Elizabeth had offered the magistrates a deal: spare her life, and she would ensure their descendants prospered for generations. The catch was a ritual performed with the blood of the truly innocent victims, binding their souls to serve her eternal existence. Thomas had participated, sealing the pact with his own bloodline. The sound of her doorbell jolting through the quiet morning made Sarah jump, her heart hammering against her ribs. She peered through the window to see a woman standing on her porch, perfectly ordinary, except for something indefinably unsettling about her presence. The woman appeared to be in her mid-40s, with dark hair and pale skin that seemed to glow in the morning light. She wore modern clothes, but something about her posture suggested another era entirely. "Dr. Mitchell?" The woman's voice carried clearly through the door, melodious but with an undertone that made Sarah's skin crawl. "I believe we need to discuss your recent discovery." Sarah's blood turned to ice. How could this stranger know about the documents? She had told no one, had barely processed the information herself. Through the peephole, she watched the woman's lips curve into a smile that never reached her eyes. "I know you're there, Sarah. Your ancestor and I were so very close. I've been waiting patiently for someone from his bloodline to find those papers. You have something that belongs to me. The documents." Sarah glanced back at the scattered papers on her desk, then at the woman who stood impossibly still on her porch. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The face, now that she truly looked, matched descriptions from Thomas's testimony. The same pale skin, the same dark eyes that seemed to hold too much knowledge. "You're her," Sarah whispered to herself, not daring to speak louder. "You're Elizabeth Hawthorne." As if hearing her thoughts, the woman chuckled softly. "Very good, descendant of Thomas. You always were the clever bloodline. That's why I chose your family for the pact. Intelligence runs in your veins, along with my magic." Sarah backed away from the door, her mind reeling. This was impossible. People didn't live for over 300 years. But the evidence was right there, standing on her porch, with a face that matched colonial descriptions and knowledge that no living person should possess. "The documents you found are just the beginning, Sarah. Your ancestor kept meticulous records of our arrangement, but what he didn't understand was that the pact bound our bloodlines together in ways he never imagined. You carry my mark now, whether you know it or not. Strange things had been happening since Sarah opened that chest. Shadows moved differently in her peripheral vision. The temperature in her house dropped without explanation. She had attributed it to stress, to lack of sleep, but now she wondered if something far more sinister was at work. I'll be seeing you soon, Sarah Mitchell. We have 3 centuries of business to discuss. The woman's footsteps receded, but when Sarah finally gathered the courage to look outside, there was no sign of anyone having been there. No footprints in the morning dew, no disturbance of the fallen leaves on her walkway. Only the lingering scent of something ancient and wrong that seemed to seep through the walls themselves. Sarah realized with growing horror that finding the documents had not been a stroke of luck or scholarly fortune. It had been planned, orchestrated by someone who had been waiting centuries for this exact moment. She was not the discoverer of this dark history. She was its next chapter, and Elizabeth Hawthorne had been patiently writing the story all along. The game had begun, and Sarah was already several moves behind an opponent who had been playing for over 300 years. Sarah's hands trembled as she dialed the Salem Police Department, but she hung up before anyone answered. How could she explain that a 300-year-old witch had visited her doorstep? Instead, she decided to do what she did best: research. If Elizabeth Hawthorne truly existed in the modern world, there would be traces, patterns, evidence that a trained historian could uncover. The Salem Historical Society archives became her sanctuary over the following days. Sarah buried herself in census records, death certificates, and newspaper archives spanning 3 centuries. What she found made her blood run cold. Elizabeth Hawthorne appeared in records every 30 to 40 years, always listed as a distant relative of the previous Elizabeth, always bearing the same distinctive features described by witnesses. In 1743, Elizabeth Hawthorne was listed as a midwife who had helped deliver the children of Salem's most prominent families. In 1789, another Elizabeth Hawthorne appeared as a wealthy widow who donated generously to the new American government. The pattern continued through the Civil War, both world wars, and into the present day. Each time, the woman appeared to be in her 40s. Each time she integrated seamlessly into Salem's community, and each time she vanished, just before people might begin to question her lack of aging. Detective Michael Torres found Sarah on her 3rd day in the archives, hunched over microfilm readers with dark circles under her eyes. A tall man with kind eyes and graying temples, he had been investigating a series of unusual deaths that had begun the same week Sarah discovered the documents. Dr. Mitchell, I'm Detective Torres. I understand you're researching the Hawthorne family history. I was hoping you might help me understand something. Sarah looked up, startled. What kind of something? 3 people have died in the past week, under circumstances that remind me of the old Salem witch trial testimonies. Livestock found drained of blood, strange symbols carved into trees, and witnesses reporting seeing a woman matching descriptions from colonial records. Sarah's heart raced. What kind of descriptions? Torres pulled out a worn notebook. Dark hair, pale skin, appears to be in her 40s. One witness swore she was floating rather than walking. Another claimed she spoke in a language that made his ears bleed. I know it sounds crazy, but you've been a detective long enough to know that sometimes crazy is just truth waiting to be understood. Sarah finished. She made a decision that would change both their lives. Detective Torres, I think I know who you're looking for. As Sarah explained her discovery, Torres listened with the practiced attention of someone accustomed to impossible stories. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. So, you're telling me that a witch from 1692 is alive and killing people in modern Salem? I'm telling you that someone with intimate knowledge of colonial Salem, access to historical records most people have never seen, and apparent immunity to aging has been operating in this town for over 3 centuries. Whether she's supernatural or just incredibly clever, she's dangerous. That evening, as they walked from the archives to Sarah's car, Torres suddenly grabbed her arm. "Don't look back, but we're being followed. Woman in a dark coat, about 40 feet behind us." Sarah's reflection in the car window revealed the truth she had dreaded. Elizabeth Hawthorne walked behind them with the fluid grace of a predator, her eyes fixed on Sarah with an intensity that made her skin crawl. When Sarah turned to face her directly, Elizabeth smiled and raised one finger to her lips in a gesture of silence. "She's not hiding anymore," Sarah whispered. "She wants me to know she's watching." Torres reached for his radio, but it crackled with static, the speaker emitting sounds that resembled whispered words in an unknown language. His service weapon felt suddenly heavy and useless against something that had survived 3 centuries of attempts to stop her. "Dr. Mitchell," Elizabeth's voice carried impossibly clearly across the distance between them, though her lips barely moved. "You cannot run from a contract signed in blood. Your family owes me a debt that spans generations. It's time to collect." The streetlights around them began to flicker and dim, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Sarah felt a pull, like invisible strings attached to her very soul, drawing her toward Elizabeth. Only Torres's firm grip on her arm kept her from walking toward the woman who had haunted Salem for 300 years. "The game has changed, Sarah," Elizabeth continued, her voice now seeming to come from everywhere at once. "I'm done hiding in the shadows. Salem will remember what true power looks like." When the streetlight stabilized, Elizabeth was gone, but her message lingered in the air like smoke. Sarah realized that her investigation had transformed from academic curiosity to a fight for survival. Elizabeth was no longer content to remain hidden, and Sarah had become the focal point of a supernatural war that had been brewing since 1692. Torres insisted on staying at Sarah's house that night, positioning himself strategically where he could watch both entrances. As they pored over the documents together, he revealed something that changed everything Sarah thought she knew about their partnership. "My great-great-grandmother was Martha Corey," he said quietly, his finger tracing the name in one of Thomas Mitchell's testimonies. "She was one of the women actually executed in Salem. My family has been passing down stories for generations about what really happened during those trials." Sarah looked up from the papers, her understanding shifting. "You're not just investigating random deaths. You're hunting Elizabeth because of what she did to your family. The stories my grandmother told weren't about innocent victims caught in mass hysteria. They were about something genuinely evil that used the trials as cover for darker purposes. Martha Corey tried to expose Elizabeth before she was silenced permanently. As if summoned by the mention of her name, a cold presence filled the room. The temperature dropped so suddenly that their breath became visible, and the documents on the table began to flutter despite the absence of any wind. A woman's voice, faint but unmistakably different from Elizabeth's, whispered from the shadows. "She speaks truth. Descendants of both victim and oppressor, Elizabeth grows stronger with each passing day." The barrier between worlds weakens as Halloween approaches. Torres drew his weapon instinctively, but Sarah raised her hand to stop him. "Martha Corey, I have watched over Salem for 3 centuries, bound to this place by the injustice of my death and the evil that was allowed to escape. Elizabeth feeds on the life force of the innocent, growing more powerful with each kill. Soon she will have enough strength to tear open the veil permanently." The ghostly presence moved closer, and Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of sadness and determination. "Your ancestors' pact was not just about prosperity, child. It was about creating a permanent gateway for entities from the shadow realm. Elizabeth is not merely a witch. She's something far older and more terrible, wearing human form." Sarah's mind reeled as the pieces fell into place. The recent murders aren't random. She's preparing for something bigger. Halloween night marks the 331st anniversary of the trial's end. If Elizabeth completes her ritual using blood from both the Mitchell and Corey bloodlines, she will become something beyond mortal understanding. Salem will become a doorway for horrors that should never walk the earth. Torres and Sarah exchanged glances, understanding the weight of what they had just learned. They were not just the descendants of Salem's dark history, they were the key components in Elizabeth's final plan. How do we stop her? Torres asked the ghostly presence. The pact your ancestor made can be broken, but only by willingly sacrificing what it has given your family. The Mitchell bloodline must renounce the prosperity and protection they have enjoyed for centuries. And you, descendant of Martha Corey, must be willing to join your ancestor in the space between worlds. The implications were staggering. Sarah would have to give up everything her family had built over 3 centuries, and Torres would have to sacrifice his life to stop a creature that had been growing in power for just as long. There's something else, Martha's voice continued, growing fainter. Elizabeth is not working alone. She has turned others over the centuries, creating servants bound to her will. Some walk among Salem's citizens even now, waiting for her signal. As the presence faded, Sarah and Torres sat in stunned silence, understanding that they were facing not just one immortal witch, but a network of supernatural entities that had been infiltrating Salem for generations. The battle for Salem would require them to risk everything they held dear, and even then, victory was far from certain. Halloween descended upon Salem like a familiar curse, bringing with it hordes of tourists eager to experience the town's infamous supernatural history. What they didn't realize was that this year, the supernatural would be experiencing them. Sarah and Torres spent the day preparing for what they knew would be Elizabeth's final gambit, but every plan they made felt inadequate against a foe who had been orchestrating this moment for 3 centuries. Strange incidents plagued the town throughout the day. A tour guide at the Salem Witch Museum reported that the wax figures had moved on their own, rearranging themselves into positions that depicted the actual executions rather than the sanitized historical displays. Children on ghost tours began speaking in voices not their own, reciting names of Elizabeth's victims from across the centuries. The temperature in certain parts of town dropped without explanation, creating pockets of unnatural cold that made people's breath visible even in the afternoon sun. Sarah felt the weight of her decision as she drafted legal documents renouncing her family's inherited wealth and properties. Every signature felt like cutting a chain that had bound her bloodline to Elizabeth's power for generations. Torres, meanwhile, prepared for what might be his final hours, writing letters to family members and cleaning his service weapon with the ritualistic care of a man heading into his last battle. As evening approached, they received an unexpected ally. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, Salem's lead archaeologist, arrived at Sarah's house with a collection of artifacts that had been discovered over the years but never properly catalogued. Among them were iron implements that had been blessed by Puritan ministers before the trials began, specifically designed to bind supernatural entities. I've been waiting 20 years for someone to connect the dots, Dr. Warren explained. My research has uncovered evidence of Elizabeth's activities spanning centuries, but no one would listen. When I heard about your discovery, I knew the time had finally come. The 3 women worked quickly to understand the binding ritual described in Thomas Mitchell's most secret documents. The process required Elizabeth to be contained within a circle of blessed iron during the moment of her greatest power, which would occur at midnight when the veil between worlds reached its thinnest point. But Elizabeth was not waiting passively for their preparations. As darkness fell, the town's electrical grid began to fail in a pattern that radiated outward from the old execution site. One by one, Salem's streetlights went dark, leaving only flickering jack-o'-lanterns and the occasional supernatural glow to illuminate the increasingly panicked crowds. Torres's radio crackled with reports from across town. People found unconscious with strange marks on their necks, witnesses claiming to see figures in colonial dress walking through walls, and an increasing number of tourists who had begun acting in ways that suggested they were no longer in control of their own minds. "She's gathering her army," Sarah realized as they watched from her window. Figures moved through the darkened streets with unnatural coordination, converging on the site where Sarah's ancestor had first made his terrible bargain. Martha Corey's spirit appeared one final time, her ghostly form more solid than before. "The time has come, my descendants. Elizabeth awaits you at Gallows Hill, where justice was perverted into something unholy. She believes she has already won." Sarah picked up the blessed iron chains, feeling their weight like the burden of 3 centuries of family guilt. Torres checked his weapon one last time, loaded with bullets that Dr. Warren had inscribed with protective symbols. They both knew that of the 3 people leaving Sarah's house that night, not all would return alive. But Salem's freedom, and perhaps the world's safety, depended on their willingness to face the darkness that had been growing in power since 1692. Gallows Hill erupted with supernatural energy as Sarah, Torres, and Dr. Warren approached the site where Salem's darkest chapter had begun. Elizabeth stood at the center of a circle formed by dozens of possessed townspeople, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. The very air crackled with malevolent power as she began the ritual that would tear open the veil between worlds permanently. "Welcome, descendants of my greatest allies and enemies," Elizabeth called out, her voice echoing with the power of centuries. "You arrived just in time to witness the birth of a new age." Sarah felt the pull of the ancient pact, trying to compel her forward, but she gripped the blessed iron chains tighter, using their holy power to resist. Torres positioned himself to provide cover, knowing that his bullets might slow but not stop the possessed townspeople who moved to intercept them. The ritual required blood from both bloodlines, and Elizabeth had planned for every contingency except one: Sarah's willingness to destroy her family's legacy. As Elizabeth began the incantation that would bind the 2 bloodlines to her eternal service, Sarah stepped forward and spoke the words of renunciation she had memorized from Thomas Mitchell's confession. "I, Sarah Mitchell, descendant of Thomas Mitchell, renounce the pact made in blood and shadow. I return to the darkness what was purchased with innocent lives. I break the chain that has bound my family to evil for 331 years. Elizabeth's expression changed from triumph to fury as she felt the power she had cultivated for centuries beginning to drain away. "You cannot break what was sealed in blood, child. Your ancestor gave me claim to your entire bloodline." But Martha Corey's spirit emerged from the shadows, joined by the ghosts of every innocent soul Elizabeth had claimed over the centuries. "A pact made through deception and murder has no power over those who choose justice over prosperity." Torres threw the blessed iron chains with perfect accuracy, and they wrapped around Elizabeth just as her stolen power began to abandon her. For the first time in over 3 centuries, she looked truly afraid. The possessed townspeople collapsed as her control over them shattered, and the supernatural energy that had been building suddenly reversed course. Elizabeth aged rapidly as the years she had stolen from her victims returned to claim her. Her face, frozen in time for so long, began to show the weight of every evil act she had committed. "This is not possible," she gasped, her voice losing its supernatural resonance. "Evil cannot endure when good people refuse to compromise with it," Sarah said, watching as Elizabeth finally paid the price for her centuries of cruelty. With a final shriek that seemed to tear the very fabric of reality, Elizabeth Hawthorne crumbled to dust, her essence finally claimed by the justice that had been denied for so long. The ghosts of her victims, led by Martha Corey, faded into peaceful light. Their long vigil finally ended. Salem's streetlights flickered back to life, and the unnatural cold that had gripped the town dissipated like a broken fever. Sarah stood among the blessed iron chains, feeling lighter than she had in days, knowing that her family's dark legacy had finally been put to rest. Torres helped the confused townspeople to their feet, none of them remembering their supernatural possession. Dr. Warren documented everything, ensuring that this time the true story of Salem's supernatural guardian would be preserved for future generations. As dawn broke over Salem, the town that had been haunted for over 3 centuries was finally free. The witch trials had truly ended, and with them the last remnant of a darkness that should never have been allowed to survive.